Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another biology class. And today we're going to start our module directed at evolution. So I'm glad you're here. Let's go ahead and jump into it. This module is going to have three lectures to it, three lectures and maybe multiple parts. This first lecture will deal with Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. The second lecture will deal with evidence of evolution. And finally, the third lecture will deal with the shaping evolutionary theory, because it's not what it was when I was a kid. They've updated it and they have some new ideas, and that might be nice to know about. So the guiding question for today, or the topic, is Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. And the question, sorry, I was jumping the gun there, is what is the theory of evolution by natural selection? It's a good question, so we're going to get into it. The new vocabulary you need to know as we're going through this are artificial selection, natural selection, and evolution. This word you've probably heard in multiple contexts, maybe not in a scientific setting, but I'm sure you've heard it before, and we'll talk about it all today. So, selective breeding is something that hopefully you remember from our units on genetics, and is the process by which a behavior develops, or a trait is developed by the breeding of certain animals and not others of the same species for preferable traits. So if I have a cow and it has a brown coat, and I like that brown coat and I want more cows to have brown coats, well, then I selectively breed for the trait brown coat. Or if I have, say, a dog that's particularly intelligent, like a poodle, and I want to pass on that intelligence, then I continue to select for intelligence in my animal's offspring and selectively breed those. And so I can funnel down breeding by selection, by me as the breeder selecting for a trait. All right, so Darwin on the HMS Beagle. This is a somewhat famed story. Charles Darwin was a young man, went on a ship and sailed around the world, and as he did so, he made many observations. He noticed that unlike the kind of accepted knowledge of the time, the Earth looked older, and that life seemed to be changing as he went around the world, but had similar patterns in similar places. And so Darwin's job on the Beagle was to be a naturalist, meaning that he would take observations of the animals and organisms as he traveled around. And so Darwin is most famous for having taken observations on the Galapagos Islands. Here's a ship, and here's old Charles Boy himself. And what he noticed in particular was things like the giant land tortoise on the Galapagos Islands. Each island had a slightly different environment, and each island had a slightly different land tortoise, and each island had, again, a slightly different environment, and it had slightly different finches. And he noticed that the further he got out from the land on this archipelago is what it's called. That's a series of islands that stretches out into the ocean. That the organisms became more and more different from the ones that were found on the mainland. He also noticed that organisms in South Africa, organisms in South America, which is where the Galapagos are, and Europe, they all had similar types of organisms, like the Patagonian hare and the European rabbit. They had very similar traits, but they weren't exactly the same. They were slightly different, but they lived in the same type of environment that you would find them in either country or in either region. And so Darwin drew upon his knowledge of what's called artificial selection, which is selective breeding, where he discovered, or he knew, that humans had, by selective breeding, changed things like sheep to produce more wool, things like dogs to be less aggressive and more intelligent, more friendly, and crops to grow larger fruiting bodies over time. These selective planting, selective breeding allowed for a pretty rapid change in an organism. And he applied this idea to nature as a whole and came up with the idea of natural selection. And it might sound kind of daunting when you see that natural selection. What on earth is natural selection? Natural selection is what can survive and breed, survives and breed. And if it can't survive and breed, it dies. And I know that sounds a little obvious, but the deal is that Darwin thought that by having nature select in the same way a human might select for certain traits and select against other traits by letting them die off, that nature itself acted kind of like an intelligence, perhaps, kind of like a human intervening to guide the development or the change over time of an organism. Instead of using artificial selection, which is much more direct, natural selection has kind of an oscillating range of values that are acceptable when it comes to a mutation or a development, a selectable trait, we'll say. And over time, the weak traits are selected out and the stronger traits are selected for. And that would be natural selection. So, for example, in the Galapagos Islands, some islands have really hard seeds that can be eaten if the finch has a hard beak, a short, hard, thick beak. Well, the birds that happen to live on that island are the ones that mutated in a way that let their beaks be a little bit shorter so they could have higher compression force, biting power, when they're breaking the seeds. And another island has insects that live inside trees or plants in the area. And so longer beaks that could burrow in and get those insects out of the foliage allowed those birds to survive. And so over time, random mutation occurred that was then selected for by natural selection. Now, it's hypothesized that Darwin, or speculated that he had formulated his theory by about 1840. Soon after, he began writing a multi-volume book compilation or compiled of evidence for evolution, and explaining how natural selection was the mechanism by which things could change over time. And again, the Galapagos finches, no, there was no maize in the Galapagos Islands, but the finch here is a good example of a organism whose beak can be a little bit longer or a little bit shorter, and it make for a high change in survivability on different islands. Darwin published one of the origin on the origin of the species by means of natural selection in 1859. So a decade or so after his theory had been started to get going. And today, scientists use evolution, or the theory of evolution, to mean cumulative change in a group of organisms through time. So, and you have to be careful with this word because it's used in a lot of context. Change over time is the simplest version of the definition of this word. Change in a group over time is also a good definition of this word. And then some people mean change over time to mean that change, all organisms came from a single organism over time in the extreme distant past. And so when you're talking about truth claims and what's scientific and what's speculative, I think pretty much everyone agrees that life changes over time. The degree to which that is possible and plausible is more debatable. So anyone who says they don't believe in evolution is using a definition of the word that is including all life coming from a single organism in the past. Generally, if someone says they believe in evolution, they could be talking about change over time, which I think just about everybody agrees with, that life changes over time. So there's that. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in the next unit when we kind of look at the philosophy of science and how it intersects with society. But for now, I think that's more than the sufficient definition. Life changes over time. Natural selection is not synonymous with evolution. It is a mechanism by which evolution occurs. So I think this is not a true statement. I think this is a poorly written sentence because natural selection is always being referred to in reference to some sort of mutation that's being selected for or selected against. And that is synonymous with evolution. Evolution is change over time. A selectable trait, natural selection, is a mechanism of evolution. And so you're not going to have evolution without natural selection. So I guess they aren't directly analogous, like they're not word for word synonyms, but they contain within them very similar ideas. Evolution is the whole change over time. Natural selection is one piece of how that happens. So, what is the theory of evolution by natural selection? Well, hopefully, I've given you enough to answer that question, at least briefly. We're going to have some more to learn about, obviously. And if you have questions, of course, do please let me know. Thank you for listening.